Mystery of history.
Welcome listeners to Mystery of History, where we unravel the defining moments of one of history's greatest geopolitical standoffs. Today we are dividing into the event that shaped the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, from alliances shattered to the arms race that kept the world on edge. Joining me today are two esteemed guests, each bringing their expertise to shed light on a key event from this era. First we have Jeff, who will take us through the Berlin Barrier and its long history. And next we have Yuan, who will explore the Cuban Missile Crisis and the space race. Buckle up, because this journey through history is one of the espionage, political maneuvers, and global consequences. Let's begin. In 1945, two bombs that will cover the sky for nearly a month were released in Japan's Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It didn't take a day for Japan to surrender to the Allies. Following the surrender of Nazi Germany and Japan, after the atomic attack of the USA, the uneasy alliance between the USA and the Soviet Union began to unravel. While the alliance was negotiated to defeat a shared enemy, when this enemy disappeared, the future was not bright. The tension began to unravel. 3 years after their surrenders, the Soviet Union already installed a government in the countries of Eastern Europe. As a result, the Allies began to accuse Stalin's royalty. They accused the Soviet Union and Stalin of trying to make Eastern Europe into a communist continent. On the other hand, Stalin suspected that the US and Britain left Germany early so that the Soviet Union and Germany would fight against each other until both weakened. Since both countries failed to trust each other, the disagreements between Stalin and the other allies at Yalta and Potsdam were somewhat obvious. How Eastern Europe was to be administered was too controversial to agree. Winston Churchill's speech made in Fulton quoted, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe," also accusing the Soviet Union of trying to control Eastern Europe. In addition, the US finally introduced the famous Marshall Aid. This was the process of providing financial aid to countries that were in danger of being dominated by communist parties. The basis of this theory was that if a country fosters and doesn't have big problems, the support for communism would not exist. From all these events connected, the division of the US and the Soviet Union became clear. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also referred to as NATO, was established in 1949 regarding the threat of communist parties. In reaction to this theory, the Warsaw Pact was established in 1955. Stalin wanted to counter what he called an aggressive alliance. Now let's focus on famous events in the Cold War. One of the fields that both countries fought with was the arms race. Even though the Cold War didn't involve direct military disputes, it did involve the competition of who would make the most powerful and mass-destructive weapon. However, it became clear that the superpowers did not intend to use these new weapons hastily nowadays. This was demonstrated during the Korean War when President Truman sacked General MacArthur for arguing in favor of using nuclear weapons to end that war. However, by developing their nuclear powers, they intended to pressure each other and show off their strong military to the world. This was based on the idea of nuclear deterrence. This suggested that the very fact of a country possessing nuclear weapons would prevent another country from threatening its interests, mainly because it won't be in favor of a nuclear attack. To maintain this upper hand, the superpowers had to continue to build up their stockpiles of more powerful nuclear weapons so that they have the power to massively retaliate against any such attack. Under this condition, there was pressure on the US government from the armed forces and arms manufacturers to increase military spending throughout the 1950s. The USA spent a total of $7,051 billion, equivalent to nearly $10 trillion in 1992 dollars. This massive investment by the USA led to the development of the USA's intercontinental ballistic missiles, in other words, ICBMs. This missile was capable of delivering a nuclear warhead anywhere in the world. In response, the Soviet Union developed its ICBMs and also built a large fleet of nuclear submarines capable of launching missiles from underwater. And the arms race ends without a specific winner between the two superpowers. The Cold War arms race was a defining factor in global geopolitics, shaping military strategies and international relationships for decades. While the world never saw direct conflict between the two superpowers, the relentless buildup of nuclear arsenals created an atmosphere of tension and fear. However, the concept of nuclear deterrence ensured that neither side acted recklessly. Competition eventually gave rise to arms control agreements such as the Strategy Arms Limitation Talks (SALT) and the later START treaties, which sought to curb the exponential growth of nuclear stockpiles. Ultimately, the arms race underscored the fragile balance of power between nations and the immense responsibility that came with wielding such destructive capabilities. Now, let's continue our journey through Cold War history. We've discussed the tensions that led to the division of Germany, but another key aspect of this era was the intense conflict between West and East Germany. Jeff, the floor is yours.
The Berlin War started as one of the most iconic and tragic symbols of the Cold War, resulting in the ideological conflict between communism and capitalism. Its rise and eventual fall encapsulate the key chapter in 20th century history. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, the country was divided into four occupation zones controlled by the Allied powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Also, Berlin lay deep within the Soviet control zone. The capital was also split into East and West sectors. West Berlin was administered by the West Allies and East Berlin by the Soviets. Tensions soon mounted between the Soviets and the Western Allies. The Western powers supported a democratic, capitalist society in West Germany, while the Soviet established a communist Germany in East Germany. Between 1949 and 1961, approximately 27 million East Germans defeated to the west, using Berlin as an escape route. This was a severe embarrassment and a massive drain of skilled laboratory and professionals from the GDR. The East German government, unable to stop the population thought propaganda or border security alone, decided to take drastic action. In the early hours of August 13, 1961, East German troops and workers began extracting barriers, utility barbed wire, laid concrete walls, actively cutting off West Berlin from the surrounding East Germany and East Berlin. Over time, the wall expanded into the fortified structure stretching 155 kilometers, including guard tower, and Vatkins trenches and the death strips, patrolled by armed soldiers with the order to shoot defectors. Families stretched were separated overnight, roads railed, and the building were abruptly split in two. The wall transformed Berlin into the tense, divided city and became a strategically responsive implementation of the Iron Curtain. Over the next 28 years, the Berlin Wall dominated the daily life of Berliners. Strict border controls, propaganda campaigns, and surveillance by the East German secret police reinforced the GDR's control. Many East Germans attempted to escape by tunneling, swimming, or even building hot air balloons. At least 140 people were framed by killings to try to confrontations, including the 1961 checkpoint standoff between American and Soviet Berliner, experiencing solidarity with West Berliners. By the late 1980s, winds of the change were sweeping through Eastern Europe. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms and made it clear the USSR would not interfere militarily in the airfare of the Satellite states. Mass protests erupted in East Germany, calling for democratic reforms and freedom of movement. On November 9, 1989, following week of civil unrest and a confused press conference by an East Germany official, thousands of citizens gathered at the wall. Border conference by an East German official. Thousands of citizens gathered at the wall. Border guard, overwhelmed and unsure of what to do, opened a gate. People began dismantling the wall with hammers and shells, simpling the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall made the beginning of German reunification, which was officially completed on October 3, 1919. More broadly, it signaled the end of the Cold War, the decline of Soviet influence in Europe, and the rise of the new geopolitical area. Today, fragments of the Berlin Walls remain as memorials, museums, and installations, and preserved sections serve as a reminder of the past and symbols of the power of human resilience and the desire for freedom.
Thank you, Jeff, for that insightful and compelling journey through history. Its fall not only reunited Germany, but symbolized the broader end of the Cold War and the resilience of those who fought for freedom. As we reflect on its legacy, let us remember the lessons it teaches us about perseverance, unity, and the enduring pursuit of liberty. Moving on, the fall of the Berlin Barrier was not the only event in the Cold War. Another massive one was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yuan, the floor is yours.
Let's be honest. When people say Cuban Missile Crisis, most of us think, wasn't that the time the world almost exploded? And yeah, you're not wrong. But how we got there, and why it ended peacefully, that's where things get wild and weirdly inspiring. So buckle up, it's 1962. The Cold War is in full swing. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in a global staring contest, each one holding a very large pile of nuclear weapons and absolutely refusing to blink. Now, here's where Cuba enters the chat. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Fidel Castro comes to power, and the US is not thrilled. I mean, imagine if your neighbor suddenly became best friends with your worst enemy, and then your enemy started moving military equipment into their garage. That's pretty much what happened. In 1962, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev secretly agrees to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. Why? A few reasons. First, to defend Cuba against another US invasion attempt. Remember the Bay of Pigs fiasco? Second, to even out the playing field, since the US already had missiles stationed in Turkey, pointed right at the USSR. Third, and honestly, to flex Soviet muscle just 90 miles from Florida. So by October 14th, America's pipelines spot the missile sites under construction in Cuba. Big yikes. President John F. Kennedy is briefed and immediately forms a group of top advisors called the XCOM, and they debate everything. Should we bomb the sites? Invade Cuba? Send a sternly worded letter? Instead, John F. Kennedy opts for what he calls a quarantine. Not a full blockade, because that could count as an act of war legally, but a limited naval line to stop more Soviet missiles from reaching Cuba. And then, on October 22nd, he goes on national TV. The message? We see your missiles. We don't like them. We will stop them. Pretty chill, right? Considering the stakes were literally planetary survival. Now the world holds its breath. October 24th. Soviet ships approach the quarantine line. Will they stop? Will they break through? Spoiler alert, they turn back. Phew. Then, Khrushchev sends a letter. On October 26th, he says, "We'll remove the missiles if you promise not to invade Cuba." Sounds good. But the very next day, he sends another letter, adding, "Also, remove your missiles from Turkey." Now, Kennedy's in a bind. Publicly agreeing to that second demand could look weak, but ignoring it could risk everything. So he makes a bold move. He publicly responds only to the first letter and sends a private message saying that the US will quietly remove the missiles from Turkey later. That way, everyone saves face. On October 28th, Khrushchev agrees. The Soviet missiles are dismantled and shipped out of Cuba. The crisis is over. No nukes, no invasion, no World War III. So what did we learn? First, communication matters. A lot. Second, so does giving the other side a way to back down without looking like a loser. Third, and maybe, just maybe, the most powerful weapon is a calm, strategic brain.
As Yuan explained, the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the most tense moments in Cold War history. It was a turning point in global diplomacy, a moment when the world stood on the brink of nuclear war and diplomacy prevailed against the odds. Finally, Yuan will take us through the most famous event, the space race.
There was a time in the Cold War when the US and the Soviet Union looked up at the sky and said, "Yeah, we're gonna fight up there now." That was the space race, which was about prestige, power, and proving that your ideology could literally leave the planet. Let's rewind to the late 1940s. World War II is over, but the Cold War is just warming up. The US and the Soviet Union are locked in a tense teardown, each watching the other's every move, waiting to see who would take the next step in the battle for global influence. Now, here's where things get spicy. October 4th, 1957. Boom. The USSR launches Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. Just a little metal beach ball with antennas, beeping its way around the Earth. But to the rest of the world, it may as well have been shouting, "Hey America, we're in space first!" The US freaks out, like full-on panic. Newspapers call it the Sputnik crisis. People worry the Soviets could launch nuclear missiles from space, because clearly the only thing worse than being bombed is being bombed from orbit. Fast forward to 1961. The Soviets win again by sending Yuri Gagarin into space, the first human in orbit. One lap around the Earth, and suddenly he's not just a cosmonaut, he's a Cold War icon. Meanwhile, in the US, everyone's like, why are we behind? We won World War II. Get us to the moon, quick! Now, President John F. Kennedy. On May 25th, 1961, he gives his famous speech to Congress where he says, basically, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because we're really, really behind." That speech kicks off Project Apollo, America's all-in mission to not just catch up, but win. Billions of dollars go into space tech, rocket engineering, and a very stylish collection of astronaut suits. Meanwhile, the Soviets are doing their own thing. lunar probes, spacewalks, sending the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space in 1963. Total pioneers. But then, July 20th, 1969. Houston, the Eagle has just landed. Boom! Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin land on the moon. Neil takes that giant leap for mankind. And suddenly, the US is planting flags on lunar soil while the USSR is like, well, we still got there first with a dog. And yes, shout out to Laika, the space pup. Gone but never forgotten. So, what was the space race really about? Yeah, it was technological. Yeah, it was political. But most of all, it showed what humans could do when we combined brainpower with ambition and just a tiny bit of we need to win at all costs. It gave us satellites, computer tech, freeze-dried ice cream, and oh, the entire internet infrastructure we rely on today. Not bad for two superpowers just trying to catch up with each other.
What an incredible journey through the defining moments of the Cold War. From the haunting shadow of the Berlin Barrier to the rather thin brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and finally to the extraordinary heights of the space race, we've seen how rivalry between two superpowers reshaped the power, not only through conflict but also through innovation, diplomacy, and determination. As we reflect on this complex chapter in history, let's carry forward its greatest takeaway, that peace often hinges not on strength alone, but on communication, compromise, and the courage to step back when the world horse is spread. Thank you for joining us on Mystery of History. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never stop seeking the deeper story behind the events that shaped our world.